Alexi, why?
Pause.
I know what I did.
How about
Like you didn't before. Wow. Demetrius wants to come and hang out. Yes.
right? So today you're doing war and very Mexico. So
Oh, you don't upload these to the data tracker.
Huh?
You upload these to the data tracker? Yeah, let's go. Yeah, sorry.
Sorry.
you are. That's
Yes,
you can get away with this.
it's my life's ambition is to be able to IEST.
Is 10 after our slot, or am I early?
10 after the slot.
Do we want to try and move people? I don't think that's
What?
Do we want to try and move people in the middle? I don't think that's
I don't think. I mean, you can go. Absolutely.
If you are.
Hey, Mark, would you like to be part of running the meeting?
Also, I think.
It's totally up to you.
Did you want to run off of your computer? Did you want to run off of your computer? Sure. Because yeah, this better
Is
than
it
this
that
thing.
bad?
This thing's this thing's crappy. It's just not the same.
Have I mentioned that my keyboard doesn't work? My spacebar died the other day. It works, I just have to slam it. So, if you have an Apple repair kit in there, I would appreciate it.
Keyboards, yeah. Do you have an adapter?
I do. I have all the things.
And you got the blue sheet started.
Yeah, the comments down.
HDMI, right?
Yeah.
Whatever it takes in American market.
Yeah.
Apparently, yeah. Jesus, what's wrong with you people?
Power wise.
Where are you guys?
I'm not plugged in.
I can tell you.
I got it right here. Yeah, I got you.
Just hand it to you.
Well, it had a nice little spark when I plugged it in too. We have 2 hours.
How long are we actually past time right now? Or
We are past time.
What time are we supposed to start?
10 minutes ago.
It's kind of sparse though.
We're 4 minutes over.
Can I have the...
Yes, please.
Oh, hello.
Do we want to ask people to move over?
Yeah.
Okay.
Hi, everybody. We're going to get started in a moment. If folks on this side of the room could consider moving to this side of the room, we might have a more intimate discussion.
Hello, test, test, test. No. Okay.
We will in a second.
That's quick. Go. HTTP poll. Chair slides. Where are the chair slides?
Now no one's on this side. Now they're all tipped over the other way.
There we go. All right, let's get started. We're a little bit over time. Sorry about that. Welcome to HTTP BIS in Prague. This is our first meeting of two. We also have another meeting on Thursday. So, next slide. So here's the note well. Please do read it. This is Monday, so it's a good time to reacquaint yourself with the note well. Check out the BCPs at the bottom. All right, next slide. All right, so we've done the note well. Blue sheets are going around right now. Please make sure you do sign one of those. And we'll need a minute taker and Jabber scribe. Do we have anyone for that yet? Don't think so. Could we get someone to volunteer to do minutes in the Etherpad? And so, by the way, we will be doing the core document issues today. So if that feels like something you want to take notes on, please volunteer. Going once. I know.
Wait. No, not yet. We can't do it yet. Oh, hi, Murray.
Hello, Mark.
Do you have your computer with you?
Yeah.
Would you like to take minutes?
Yeah. Just poke me to make sure the major things get in, because my attention may drift a bit. But yes, I'm happy to write things down for you.
Murray sounds pretty jet lagged. Who else is here?
Thank you very much. All right. I'll coach the new guy.
Okay.
Great, thank you.
And poke him if he falls asleep.
All right, and anyone in Jabber? Yep, great, thank you. One other announcement that we do have is that we are going to have a change of responsible AD for the group. So Alexi has been doing a fantastic job of ADing us so far. So thank you for your service as AD. And we will be switching over to have Barry as our AD starting on Wednesday, I think. So
Thank you, Alexei. Thank you. And that actually concludes the second time that Alexei's been the AD for this working group, and it will now commence the second time that Barry will be the AD for this working group. So we'll need Lisa to come back to get the trifecta. I think. Yeah.
all right, so just quickly to go through our agenda. Today we are going through HTTP core. We're going to have some updates from the editors and then spend the remainder of the time going over the issues that are labeled as discuss. Here's a preview of Thursday. We're going to go through all of the extensions and talk about Quick and HTTP3, as well as proposed and related work. And with that, I think we should get started.
So Julian, did you update your presentation? Last week. Oh. That's true. Oh yeah, thank you. Okay. You can tell I was probably flying at the time, so. All right. Would you like to come up and give your presentation, Julian?
Next slide.
Broken spacebar, sorry.
One slide back. Okay, we submitted new drafts before this meeting. Drafts are linked there with diffs, and I don't think, do we need to review anything we did for these drafts? No. Okay, next slide. A bit of statistics. We've got still a few errata that we haven't dealt with. Some will be rejected during this session, I hope, by Alexei. So I'm keeping track of the HTTP errata, map them to GitHub issues, and so that we always have a complete picture of where we are with the errata. There's a summary page linked from that slide, but it's also on the front page on GitHub. Next one. So half of the issues that have been raised against the old specs has been closed, a few more today. Of the 74 that were open last week, 50 are editorial. So I guess some 20 plus a few more are non-editorial design issues. We have labeled a few of those with a discussed label because we want to look at them today. And that's what we are going to do now. I think there are no more slides.
That's your last slide. Thank you. Short and to the point. Okay. No. No, wrong side. Sorry. Sorry, it's hard to type with a Band-Aid. And that's definitely not the right website. Okay. I could have. All right. So we'll start with the issues we've marked as discuss and go from there, I think. Let's see if we have time for other issues. So the first one here is issue 203. Expect should be a list header. We noticed in the discussion of another issue, which we might touch later on, that in the HTTP BIS effort way back 10 years ago, I guess, we made a decision to lock down the expect header to just one value, 100 continue. We said this mechanism is not useful for new extensions. We don't intend for new extensions to be identified or defined. And so we're going to lock the syntax of this expect header to just one value. The problem with that is that it was originally a list header, and it is now no longer a list header, which creates some interesting problems in error handling and in how the header is defined, because we've changed its A, B, and F retrospectively. And so we discussed this briefly. We had an editors meeting just before the meeting here, and we discussed returning its A, B, and F to be a list header so that it behaves in reasonable ways when more than one value is encountered. That will probably entail defining some error handling for a couple of different situations. And we almost thought this was an editorial issue, but we wanted to fly it in front of the working group to see if anybody had any concerns about doing that. If you have such concerns, now would be a good time to talk about them. Does everyone understand the issue? Okay. I'm very tempted to ask if anyone cares about the issue, but I'll withhold. So we'll go ahead and incorporate what we think is a good resolution for that. And if people have an issue with that, please bring it up.
So I can capture these for you.
You can, thank you. That'd be lovely. Next up is issue 202. We had a request. In HTTP-BIS, we talked a little more precisely about how some request methods syntactically can have a request body because we really want to keep message parsing generic. We don't want to have a message parser understand the specific semantics of an HTTP method to be able to parse a message because it's not reliant upon the method. And so we tightened up language about that to make it clear that get and delete syntactically can have a body. It's just they don't mean anything. And we had an issue raised here that we weren't clear enough in that people think that because we say a payload within a delete request message has no defined semantics, and it might cause some existing implementations to reject the request, some people will interpret that as I can define the semantics myself. And so we have people continuing to use request bodies on get and delete, and there's some controversy about whether that's a good or bad or allowed or disallowed thing in HTTP. Because effectively, although we clarified, the difference between a body on a message at a generic level and a body on a message for particular methods, in terms of whether they have semantics or not, we didn't clarify who's allowed to make the decision of when a body is defined for a method. If we don't define semantics of a body for get, for example, can someone come along and say, well, for my resources, yes, get has meaning, a get body has meaning. And so we discussed this before, and the conclusion that Roy and Julie and I came to, which we wanted to bring to the group and start a discussion here, was it seems that we probably forget can strengthen that with languages along the lines of something like senders should not generate requests with message bodies. To make that pretty clear what that means, we want to reinforce that's not coupled with the parsing, that a generic parser doesn't have to understand the message body, but strengthen this notion that if you try and create a get with a message body, you're going to have some bad interoperability problems because proxies and CDNs and load balancers and generic servers and fetch and web application firewalls and everyone else will very likely blow up if you try and put a message body on a get. And then the other thing we discussed was for delete, some folks have use cases for putting message bodies on delete to modify the semantics of that delete. I think Julian was saying that some people want to do things like say that when you delete this, still keep it in version control, for example, or still keep it a history of some sort, or if you have other features around what is effectively a file system there, you might want to modify those semantics. And the question there is, is a message body the right way to convey those semantics? Or should they be message headers? And what advice do we want to give as a working group in those situations? And it seemed to us that we need to have a conversation as a working group about what best practice is there before we can come to a decision about whether or not we want to make recommendations about bodies on delete. Does that seem reasonable to folks as a direction to go on both of those? Or any other comments? Form an orderly line. I got a thumbs up from Mike. I got a thumbs up from Victor. Hey. And from Alan. Okay, we're now going to go to a thumbs up based communication protocol. Okay, we have multiple thumbs up. Go. All right. I think the practical implication here is that we'll go ahead and do that for get. And we'll probably open a new issue to start discussing what bodies on deletes might mean and whether that's actually a good idea or not. And that might be a much more involved discussion. Patrick, are you going to talk at the mic? Oh, wow. There's a mic right here, man. It's all good. No, you're not.
We're prepped for everyone else. Yeah, I was going to say, I think the same reasons that bias get it, which are essentially, you're not going to get end-to-end interop, right? If you
just a little closer.
I think the same reasons that bias, the decision you've talked about for get, which is you're not going to get sort of end-to-end interop around that message body getting through, apply just as strongly to delete. So I would encourage the authors to sort of start from that position on delete as well, instead of with a blank slate.
Personally, I agree with you, Patrick. But I don't necessarily represent all of the editors in that. So Thank you. Yeah.
Yeah.
Fight. Oh, Victor. Well, Julian's getting it. Victor.
Oh, I just wanted to say that as an author of HTTP reverse proxy, there are application authors who really believe that GET having a body is a good idea, and they ruin quite a bit of my mornings. So I would appreciate this to be clarified strongly.
Thank you.
Julian Reschke. So when we talked about that earlier today, I made the point that we probably shouldn't have too many categories of payloads: ignored payload, discouraged payloads, embraced, and so on. And I think delete is very similar to options, not very similar to get. And that's why I think that the answer for delete is different than for get.
And that's a good point, actually. So the other model we were looking at, if you look at the language around options, if I can get it up here in readable form, is that readable for folks? Let's see, where is it? A client that generates an options request containing a payload body must send a valid content type header field describing the representation media type. Although this specification does not define any use for such a payload, future extensions to HTTP might use the options body to make more detailed queries about the target resource. Responses to the options method are not cacheable. Really, I think we might even want to modify the language there a little bit, because there's an implication there that only extensions to HTTP, someone might read that to say that only the HTTP working group can do that, which is not quite true. Anybody can mint a media type, so anybody can. And I was concerned that we still might be in the same situation where web application firewalls and other folks wouldn't take a payload on a delete potentially. And Julian did point out that most web application firewalls don't like delete full stop. So I think it's reasonable to think about using this kind of language for delete personally, but I'd like to get a little more data first. Any other comment? Julian? Yeah, if you could open that just to, yeah, that would be nice. You may probably editorial, I'd say. Next up, Quicken HTTPS number 194, we're going to discuss later. I think Mike Bishop has a presentation together for this, right? Okay. Sorry? Thursday. Yes, that's on Thursday. Sorry, yeah. Next up, 165, updating stored headers. So HTTP caching requires stored headers to be updated on a 304 or a head response. But we neglected to do a bunch of stuff. We didn't specify what to do about HTTP1 connection related headers. Conceptually, those headers are kind of removed, before they're put into the cache or forwarded, but we don't actually specify that really clearly anywhere. And then we noted that other browsers emit other headers, such as content -star, next WebKit -star headers. Apache has a whitelist of headers that it uses when it's updating. There's a bug I raised in Apache a while back for that, and I think that's why it's with them. And intermediaries are also reluctant to update headers for performance reasons, because you have to rewrite an on-disk object, and because headers are potentially unbounded in size, that's difficult to do depending on your architecture as an intermediary, as a cache. And so this issue is basically, what do we do about all of this? If we go down a ways, there's a discussion about individual ones. Yeah, those chairs are really interesting, aren't they? Where is it? There we go. I created a test suite that does this and some other stuff. And yeah, that's an eye chart, sorry. It does some interesting stuff here. You start with a lot of green, and then we quickly have implementations that don't do any header updating for performance reasons. And then we have implementations that make some decisions. So like the assertions that all browsers act the same didn't turn out to be true. So content foo, for example, is updated in 2 browsers, but not 2 other browsers. And X content foo and so forth and so on. But then the browsers all do the same thing for this block of headers here, for content location, content MD5, and content type. And then we go back to varied behaviors for other things like X-frame options and XXSS protection. Who came up with that one? And then there's some weirdness around cache control and public key pins and a few other things. Then we go to cookies, which cookies are special in so many ways. So we gathered some data, and then I believe Jeffrey did, oh no, Jeffrey did a PR. There we are. Jeffrey did a PR. Is Jeffrey here? Hi. And so this PR, I'm going to have to make it smaller. There we go. Adds a section, and this was discussed in the issue as well, talking about storing response header fields. So saying that when a cache stores a response, it needs to prune some header fields. And that's the hop-by-hop header fields, which are listed in the connection header. And we actually had a discussion just earlier about whether we need to have a fixed list again of those or not, because practically most implementations have a fixed list as well. Even if it's not in the connection header, they'll still prune it for things like transfer coding and stuff like that in connection. Header fields listed in the no cache response directive in the cache control header field, which is, according to my testing, so hopeful. But anyway, that's a separate issue. I actually think we have an issue open for that. And then a list of header fields here. And a to-do that the above list is not final. And then there's another section that's added, which is header fields that aren't freshened upon a 304. So ones that, or actually I think a head as well, correct? That when you freshen headers on disk or in memory, that you don't include these headers. And that's content coding, content length, content location, content MD5, range type, E-tag, proxy auth, TE, frame options, XXS protection, and the X content and the X-WebKit headers. And so I'd like to have a discussion about, I think this general, personally, I think this general approach is about the right one with some tweaks. I think the big question is, what are the right headers to put on this list? I think I said in the ticket, some of these are slam dunks, connection, keep alive, proxy auth, stuff like that, where it is obviously tied to the connection context, and it makes no sense to persist this stuff. Set cookie and set cookie 2 are interesting because in my testing, people do actually store those on disk. Where is that one? That's under other, I think. So yeah, they store cookies, except for a couple of exceptions, which is always going to be the case. So I want to understand more why those are being put there. And of course, things like public key pins and STS. The overriding concern for me being here that if we have some special headers that aren't based upon the connection context, there may be more special headers that people, especially browsers, want to add in the future. And we don't have a mechanism to update all the proxies in the world simultaneously. So I'd really like to understand why some of these headers are on this list. And in the browser, header fields that aren't freshened ones, again, like I can kind of understand why content length is there. And content MD5, there's an argument to be made there. But for some caches, content type, if you have a content provider and they put the wrong content type on a response, and then they correct it, or other metadata, they correct it in their server configuration, and the CDN or the reverse proxy, whoever else is a downstream cache, doesn't do that update, then that gets stuck in their cache, and that's not a great situation. So I'd like to understand what the reasoning is behind some of those as well. as well as the X content and X WebKit, which as we saw are not consistently implemented across browsers.
Mike Bishop, Akamai, but speaking from my experience making this list at Microsoft.
Yeah.
We made the decision to exclude basically anything that dealt with content interpretation on the logic that you are caching, you're pulling from cache because it hasn't changed. And if it hasn't changed, that means that nothing about how you interpret that content should be different. If you want to change, give me the same body, but tell me it's now a different content encoding or a different content type, I'm going to interpret that differently and get a different output than I previously would have. That's a different response. It should have a different E tag.
Jeffrey.
This is Jeffrey Yaskin. I want to say that I made these lists so that we would have the structure to discuss things in them. I am not prepared to defend any member of the list.
Okay. My overall concern here is that we have different components that are behaving in different ways pretty radically. If you combine the Apache bug with the fact that some CDNs don't and reverse proxies don't update headers on disk, and the browser behaviors where they emit some headers, if I'm a content person and I update something on my origin server and it doesn't change in all these caches for a variety of reasons, that doesn't seem like a great experience for anybody. So we should do better. That's my overriding concern here.
Yeah. So Martin Thompson, if you are a content person and you change some of these things and you know that they're not going to change as a result of you just sending a 304 response, then don't send a 304 response. But you do need to know. And I agree that it's worth having some rules written down here. I'd like to understand what the principles are behind the selection here. This looks like a random grab bag of things. And you can reason about each one individually and say, okay, well, content length, maybe that's being used for framing of the response, and therefore we might want to be a little careful with that one and just ignore it. But E-tag, I mean, is it possible to produce another E-tag that is valid for the same content? And I don't know how to reason about that one. Yeah. And so is this stuff about the resource, or is it stuff about the request, or what have you? And so if you go back to the previous list, these are things that don't hit the disk. Those all appear to be either things about the connection or things about the request context that don't really relate to the actual representation that we're talking about, or anything that might want to be persisted. If you talk about that being a principle, then I think we could probably get behind something along those lines. But I don't know what you do for some of these other things.
I mean, in the case of things like set cookie, you know, what I have always understood is that if you don't want your cookie cached, you don't make the response cacheable. And if you do want your cookie cached and replayed to other people, or reused, then you do. And the weird thing is that's what everybody's implemented.
Right. So,
but there's a common conception that a lot of people have that cookies aren't cached automatically, and that turns out not to be true.
That's not true, no.
And the web still works, so
Well, that merely suggests that there might be, the cookie might still be on this list, but you say that some of the things on this list may still be cached by intermediaries, and therefore, if you don't want it to be persisted on disk, you need to use the cache control of the appropriate sort.
Well. And I can kind of see that for set cookie because it's so intrinsically in the architecture of what we're doing. What concerns me on this list more is something like clear site data, which is very new, and we may have another new one like that in 2 or 3 months, or I mean, Mike West produces a lot of these specs. So do we add more stuff to that list over time, or do we just tell people if you put clear site data in your response, don't make it cacheable? It seems pretty reasonable to me.
So that speaks to a different approach entirely then, which is to say that those things that are on this list don't necessarily get this special treatment, but instead that if you are providing one of these things that's on this list, expect it to be cached if you don't want it to be cached, therefore do the following thing.
Well, there's some things on this list that do need special treatment, like proxy authentication.
Right.
People
I
having
think
connection. Yeah.
Yeah. If you want to draw the line there, I think connection is pretty clear.
Connection is special. Yeah. And I just, in terms of where some of these other things came from, as far as my research took me, it looks like somebody put this stuff, things like X content, and even the content, some of the content dash stuff, into, I think, Mozilla in the early 2000s. And I think Patrick said that the actual history was lost in the sands of subversion somewhere, and that it would take an enormous effort to actually dig it up. But and it looks like other implementations have, to a large degree, cargo culted from that. And I think, I strongly suspect that the original reason that a lot of these were put in was because of a misreading of the language in 2616 around entities that we eventually, entity headers that we eventually removed because we realized it didn't make any sense. But of course that was done before we did 7230. 7320, 7230. So yeah, if people, if we can come up with and I like what you said before, if we can come up with reasonable principles for why things are on this list, that's great. But I don't want to just put them on the list because of we're not sure why they shouldn't be on the list, you know?
This is Jeffrey Yaskin again. This second list is all things that the cache may fail to cache. It's not a requirement not to cache it. And so I was super inclusive here. If I knew of a client that didn't cache them, and this list may just be a copy of what Chrome doesn't, in practice, doesn't cache, I included it. There was no thought behind it.
I'm inclined to take the ones where all the proxy, all the caches, all the browsers act the same way, a lot more seriously. But the assertion that, you know, if you cache this header, if you don't do that, it'll break something, it doesn't really wash with me if there are a couple of browsers out there working just fine and they're caching it.
Yeah, so this list is to allow the existing implementation variability. It was to describe reality, not to say anything normative. And it's fine with me if the room decides to say something more normative. That's just why they're here.
Okay. Can we get the browsers to align their behaviors? I understand they're really keen on that.
It's totally plausible, yeah.
Okay.
And this is the mechanism to do it. Just
okay.
Yeah.
So it sounds like maybe we should talk a bit more and on the issue and maybe in the hallway and figure out a way to chop this up and attack, you know, categorize these and figure out where we need to focus more.
Yes.
Okay, cool. Yeah. Thanks. Martin?
One last thing. By including this list in there, you do have normative force, and that normative force is on the generator of the response. And that is to say that they have to generate a complete response and can't do something like a 304 if they want to update this information. Thanks, Murray.
It's keeping Murray awake.
So I would be a little less than promiscuous in this case. And like I said, principles.
I want to end up on just actually dig down a little bit on something you said earlier, which is that the content producer, if they change one of these things, it's not the same response and they shouldn't generate a 304. The problem is their implementation does it for them. They don't have control over that.
Right, and so their implementation has to be aware of that and needs to, and that's challenging.
The problem here is that no matter what we do, some implementation behaviors are going to have to change. And implementers don't like changing behaviors for lots of good reasons.
Right.
And so, yeah.
And so whatever decision you make has to be pretty firmly grounded in something. And I don't know what this list is grounded in. I think I can see where the former list is grounded, but this one is a little hairier. And I think I prefer to simply have, well, clients. I don't want to exclusively limit this to browsers, but clients agree on what it is that they're not going to update.
Yeah. Technically, it's caches. Caches can be anywhere.
Right.
They're not associated with a client or a server. Well, they are, but they're separate.
Okay. Caches.
Yeah, caches.
Yeah.
Okay. There we go. That was status codes and caching. Next up is a fun one. It's header terminology, number 111. And we said that last time we didn't want to bike shed this in a big room with a lot of people because that would be a complete waste of time. So we bike shedded it in a much smaller room. Did we?
We skipped a bunch. No, we're actually on
You're on-
137.
Oh, yeah. No, that's just my jet lag speaking. Never mind. Okay. Updating store headers. Serializing a header line. So Anna says in web platform tests, we discovered that browsers serialize request header lines differently, with Chrome not serializing the space after the colon if the value is empty. Presumably this only affects HTTP1, and I'm not sure how it relates to HTTP core. I think it's worth documenting. Otherwise, he's looking at trying to do this in fetch, but they've tried to stay clear of requiring particular things there. And so I think I made a suggestion down here. Let's see. Keep on going. Roy, oh, okay. That was yours, okay. So I think the proposal is to, I thought I had a proposal in this one. This one? So he wants us basically to say that when you serialize an HTTP header line and it has multiple value, and you combine two header fields, sorry, that you combine them with a comma and then a space, I believe. That's my understanding.
No, he's actually referring to this. This is Roy Fielding. He's referring to the space after the colon from the field name. So
Oh,
field
that one.
name
Okay.
colon space, and
Correct.
he wants that to be a specific serialization for browsers in particular. And as near as I can tell, the only response we can have to that is what I put at the bottom.
Yeah.
As my comment, which is we don't have a common serialization format for HTTP messages. It kind of defeats the purpose of having this loosey-goosey syntax anyways.
Right.
And we can't really do what working group does and say, okay, you 4 developers are going to all agree, and they say, yay. Sorry, we've got 5,000 developers and none of them agree on anything. So, I mean, what we have in the draft right now is that this is what the recommended serialization is, that recommend that there no space before the colon and a single space after the colon. And as far as I know, every single producer produces that, unless they're trying to deliberately attack a service. And it seems to be enough, so I don't see any further purpose for this.
I know now what I was thinking that there's another issue we have, which is about the comma, which I have different feelings about, but I think I agree with you here. I just don't see enough of an issue here to bother. I mean, I guess the only other thing is he's not asking for us to add a lot of text, but I'm not seeing a particularly large amount of value. Anybody else have any thoughts about it? Martin, you're looking very not caring. Okay.
It is Monday.
Okay. All right. Well, I think then the notion, does anyone have a problem with closing this issue with no action in the room? All right. We'll take that to list, but that sounds like the way forward. If no one can muster, if Anna can't convince us to care about it, then that's what we'll do. Oh, this is a fun one. Quoted cache control directives, number 128. So in my testing, I was checking to see whether cache control max age equals quoted 3600 is handled correctly by caches. And I can show you the results. It's depressing. Of all of these caches, the only ones who actually handle quota cache control are Safari and Apache Traffic Server. Leif, congratulations. And so the question at hand then, I don't know how to get rid of this window now, is, it's not interoperable. Should we change the spec to reflect that? And I noted later on in HTTP-BIS, where is my cursor? There it is. I thought we decided to make this should not generate, must accept. We actually did something a little more subtle. I think we made it should not generate, ought to accept. Was that where we ended up, Julian? And so the question is, should we change the requirement levels here? And we discussed this as the editors earlier on, and we didn't come to any conclusion, at least not until I went out to get some water. Did you come to any conclusion after I went to get some water? No. So the actual spec text here is already a little bit confusing. Oh, come on. So we first say here, they have an optional argument that can be used both token and quoted string syntax. For the directives defined below that define arguments, recipients ought to accept both forms, RFC 6119, I believe, even if one is documented to be preferred. For any directive not defined with this specification, a recipient must accept both forms. And then for max age, we say this directive uses the token form of the argument syntax, e.g. max age equals 5, not max age equals quoted 5. A sender should not generate the quoted string form. So I guess the question is, considering the incredibly low level of interoperability for quoted string forms here, is should not adequate. Can we communicate this any clearer or not? I don't have incredibly strong feelings about this. I would like to see stronger interop, but Julian.
The one thing that we found while you were away is that at least for one test case where you said that HTTPD fails,
yes.
Roy says that it can't possibly fail, so we need to investigate why you have a test failure there.
Yes.
And maybe if the result in the test sheet is wrong for HTTPD, it's also wrong for something else. So we need to find out what's wrong here.
That's, I think, what we need to do next, yes.
You just say it could possibly fail. It's just not failing for the right reason.
And to continue on that, that's exactly the thing that we're investigating. If what we are trying to understand is, are there parsers that are written in the same way that still do not accept that? So is this a conscious decision by a programmer to reject that value? And if so, why? Or is this something else? That's what we need to find out.
Excuse me. All right, so I think we just need to continue digging away at what's going on there.
This is Roy again. If possible, as we go through these issues, if you can identify something that needs to be attributed or assigned to an editor, please do so now, because I will forget this tomorrow.
So Patrick is recording kind of what we talked about
good.
in the actual issue.
That's great.
Yeah. And I think in this case, we need to do some more testing and refinement of the tests. For me, it's just if we can give the clearest possible guidance to people using the web from an interoperability standpoint. And I feel like we fail. Sometimes what we provide is so abstract or so nuanced that it goes over people's heads, as we saw with the get body discussion elsewhere. I just want to try and clarify that. That's why I'm raising this kind of issue. That takes us to 120 status codes and caching. 7234 says that a response can't be stored if the cache doesn't understand its status code. That seemed odd to me because, at least for part of the life of that spec, one of the principles we had was that you can look at a response and not have to understand its status code and still know how to cache it. So the cache control directives define the caching semantics of a response in combination with the request and lots of other context, of course. And we talked about cacheable by default a little bit. And so, yeah, I then dug up the thread in the BIS discussions that led to this, which we can actually link through the wonders of the web. And we decided to tie the cacheability of a response to understanding its cache to its status code, so that we didn't have to go and figure it out for each individual status code, I guess. So at least that's what it says here. And as I say here, the problem is that if I want to deploy a new status code, then caches have to be updated to understand that status code before they can cache it. I can't just say, okay, here's status code for 49 or whatever, and it'll work automatically with reverse proxies and CDNs and browser caches and be stored properly, which seems like a nice property if we plan on introducing new status codes. Roy notes, I think, that we don't, he doesn't have a problem discouraging the definition of new status codes. It is a constrained space, so maybe it's okay that rolling out new status codes is a little bit slower because they don't initially get cached. And so we talked about this in Bangkok. And then I remembered that there was another part of 7234 that says no to all status codes can be cached if the response saying current has explicit freshness information. So we actually conflict with ourselves now, which is not great. And then I talked a little bit more about what I just said, which is introducing new status codes. I think, Roy, one of the main points for you was that if we allow any status code with caching metadata to be cached, that implies that we can't introduce new special status codes like 206.
Yeah, or something like 206 where the status code is saying, like, say we introduce a new status code to handle the specific 304 header fields that wouldn't normally be updated, but in this case we want them to be updated.
Sure. Special handling.
Yeah. Crazy.
Yeah. We take that tool away.
Yeah, I don't think any of that's likely, but yeah, that's
right.
The technical distinction. My concern about the change here really is more of what are we trying to fix in the sense that are we actually, what condition is so important that the cache be able to cache a status code that it's never seen before? I mean, caches are there for a reason. They're typically to improve performance. Why do we need to improve performance for this specific type of response, given that we've never seen it before?
So to the first point about 206, I sketched out here that you could define new extensions to allow special status codes to be defined and be exempted. So that's, it's ugly, but it's possible. So that I don't think that takes it off the table. In terms of why do you need to cache it, I don't know. I'm a caching guy. I like caching. My company caches. I play with browser caches. If we introduce a new status code, I'm really impatient to get the freaking thing cached. I don't want to have to file a Firefox ticket and a Chrome ticket. And are there any other browsers? No, Safari ticket, I guess. And I guess it's just 3 tickets really. Used to be more.
Can you clarify if you're talking about explicit?
Right, but we're talking about
only explicit freshness. Yeah. So.
But you want it to be cached by caches that don't actually understand the new status code.
Sorry?
But you want it to be cached by caches that have not yet been updated to understand the code. I can understand the desire to have it be cached by caches that understand what the code means, but I don't see the performance desire to have it automatically cached even though the cache does not understand what it means. But it just doesn't seem to be a problem we need to solve.
Caching is a generic function though. The semantics can be decoupled from that of the new status code. You don't have to understand the status code to cache it.
Well, sure, but
unless it's doing one of these things.
Yeah, but most caches operate on the presumption that they're only caching a limited amount of resource responses because they have space controls. Typically caches don't try to cache the entire web. They have some limitations per cache.
I think it's
what I'm saying is that it seems very odd to be going down into this level of detail for a performance improvement. that is very mystical. But, if you want to solve it in general, that I can understand that from a theoretical point of view.
I think especially for cases like when people are doing caching of APIs, for HTTP APIs, for example, and they're more likely to use some more esoteric status codes. And I would like them to be able to use the full capability of the cache, not just what's in the normal web footprint. And then, if you look at the status codes that we've introduced over time, 65, 85, the additional HTTP status codes, which you and me and just you and me worked on. All of these, have potential caching that could get some value from caching. Well, at least some of them. Too many requests, for example, in certain circumstances, and certainly 451, which was another big one that we added a little while back. And yes, you have to be careful to make sure that when you cache them, they are served again in the right circumstances. But we have the mechanisms to do that now. So
I agree with that, and I suggest that the next step is to say, sounds great, Mark. When are you going to propose a cache control thing for the case of this is really a 206 kind of situation?
It's right there.
Is it in there already?
Yeah, right there.
Okay.
Oh, sorry, right there.
Okay. So, in pull request, is this assigned to you right now, or? I'm trying to give you a task item so I don't have to do it.
Can I give you a task? Can you give me feedback on that strawman mechanism and see how much it makes you puke?
Sure.
And then we'll go from there. Sure. If that's something that you see is halfway viable, then I can flesh it out. You don't have to do it right now. Okay. Okay. You're a busy man. It's okay. So here's the fun one. 111. I was so impatient to get to before. So a number of us have noticed that the terminology around HTTP headers is fuzzy and awkward and misunderstood a lot. We need more precision when we talk about these things, especially now that we have not only HTTP1 but HTTP2 and coming to HTTP3, and there are different ways of actually carrying these things in the wire. And so I think in Bangkok or thereabouts, we decided that we didn't want to bike shed this as an entire group. So Julian and Roy and I bike shedded this for actually a surprisingly short amount of time earlier today. And we came up with a proposal that we wanted to walk people through and see how much people liked this or disliked it. And so what we thought we'd do is introduce a number of new terms in the semantics document, so generic to any version of HTTP. A list-based field refers to a field that uses the list rule or a similar construct. In other words, comma-separated multiple value header field. A singleton field refers to the opposite of that, a field that does not use that kind of rule. It only is supposed to have one value. Now, there are going to be circumstances where, due to an attack or a bug or whatever else, a singleton field has more than one value and they're comma-separated, and we need to describe how to handle that sort of situation. We would actually have another open issue to talk about that for our existing headers. A field item refers to a single value in a list-based field. So a list-based field is composed of field items. And a combined value or a combined field value refers to all instances of a list-based header after combining with commas. So that's the end result of the common algorithm we have of, I need to understand the value of this header field, but it might be split across multiple instances. And so here we are. And that's actually a term that's already used in fetch. So that's a nice harmony that we have there. And then in messaging, we use field instance to refer to a received on the wire field name value pair. So the one line, as it were, and maybe we should call it a field line, but I think instance is probably okay. We can bike shed these. But these are kind of the distinctions that we've been thinking about for a brief amount of time today. Julian, you have additional thoughts?
Field line wouldn't make sense in the HTTP2 context where you have the same thing on the wire, but not as a line.
True. Does that improve things in people's minds? Does that help? I see thumbs up from Alexei. That's fantastic. Even though we're breaking from the great tradition of MIME.
Alan,
to the mic, please.
Alan from Dell. It's clarification. So anything that's list-based is implicitly combinable or can be referred to as combined, or is there?
Sorry, I couldn't quite hear that.
Is everything that's list-based combinable?
Yes.
Okay.
But really, singletons are too, in case they're syntactically bad. All headers are combinable.
Right, yeah, all header fields are combinable, but some would end up in semantic errors after you combine them.
Right.
So,
This is Jeffrey Eskin, except for set cookie, which is magic.
Set cookie is always special, yes. Thank you, Mozilla. Patrick wants to point out it wasn't him.
That's not why I have the mic. So when a other specification that perhaps not part of the core specifications makes the reference to a response header, meaning the value of a particular response header, and it receives a nit during last call that's not actually a defined term. What is the suggestion here for the replacement for the colloquial response header?
I think in our current, we haven't addressed one aspect of the discussion that we previously had, but the current thinking is that in almost every case, what other specifications will want to be talking about is a combined value. Because they are not interested in, or if they're talking about a part of that combined value, it might be the field item. But that's, and they might say this is a singleton field or this is a list-based field. But beyond that, they're mostly, when they're talking about the value, it's usually the combined value.
but the idea we talked about earlier was that in addition to this terminology, we would also have a section about colloquial terms and what they might refer to. So they would still have a definition in the spec. It's just that we wouldn't be using those ourselves anymore, other than.
Yeah, I think that's very positive, because adding, a new term to this mix, I don't think is going to make the problem, of interop any better with people that do feel like they, understand the semantics, but have no idea what a combined field value might be.
Yeah. So formally, if I were to talk about, for instance, content length, I would talk about the content length header field combined value. Is that the formal string of?
I would probably start by saying the content length header is a singleton field. Its combined field value does blah.
No, but if I'm talking about in a spec that I want to talk about the value of the thing in that spec, I don't need to say that it's singleton. I can simply say that it's combined.
If you're not defining it, yeah.
Yeah, I'm not defining it. Yeah.
You could just say, well, you could just say
Is there any sense in saying value, just using value in that context? I mean,
what we're probably going to end up saying is that in most cases when people use the term field value, they really mean the combined field value.
yeah. Does anyone use that field in that context?
Sorry?
Because people talk about the value of the content length header.
Yeah.
I mean, that's the colloquial form.
So
right?
that was the other thing which I mentioned, which you didn't get to, is can we omit field in some cases?
Yeah.
And I think that colloquially, there's no question that people do that. The question is whether specifications should do it.
I got from Roy that you're definitely not going to do it in this spec, and you may encourage people in other specs not to do the same. But there's a question of correctness. That's
I think, if I remember our discussion in Bangkok, the feeling in the room was that it's something we should consider allowing. I think my gut feeling is we're going to end up in a place where in our specs we don't do it, but we don't disallow it in other specs.
Yeah, I think that's
and we provide people with a hook to do that.
That's a very fine, pragmatic approach.
Yeah. And I guess what I probably want to sleep a couple times on this and make sure that we've covered the space adequately and we don't need any additional terms and that these fit all the uses that we have. I think we're most of the way there, though. I think this is pretty good progress.
This is Jeffrey Eskin. Martin's comment made me realize that you should have an example of referring to the combined value of a field so that people have a thing to copy when you wind up with spec wording.
Examples are always good. Yes, thank you. Okay. How are we doing on time?
Pretty well.
Okay.
We've done it for 50 dollars.
Okay. Do we have anything else today or? Okay, no, okay,
That's
good.
it. You're
Yep.
good. You're good.
Next up, 54, method registry should include cacheability. And Jeffrey, you raised this actually. So I think we came to a place in discussion where people felt that this wasn't useful to put in the registry. Is this where we're still at? And I think, the terminology around cacheability is always a little bit confusing because we talk both about cacheable methods and cacheable responses. And those are very different things. And if you have to walk through the entire algorithm to use them both to figure out when you can store something. But having said that, Jeffrey, is this still something you feel like would be helpful or have we convinced you?
This is Jeffrey Askin. If you scroll down to my later comment, I believe I still agree with it. So my original complaint was incorrect. I suggested some changes to the wording that would have prevented me from getting confused enough to file the initial complaint. And they might be editorial, but I don't know.
Okay. I'm happy to flip it to editorial and take that as a way forward if everyone else is.
Mike Bishop, if you could scroll back down for a second, past my, down.
Down, okay.
So you wanted to address the 7540 issue by parenthetically adding also known as cacheable methods where?
Sorry, could you repeat that?
In your last comment, you suggest addressing the problem with getting rid of this that it would create for H2 by parenthetically adding also known as cacheable methods, but I'm not sure where you propose to add that.
Yeah, that's a good question.
So basically, I think the discussion here seemed to go in a direction of saying that cacheability is a property of the response, not a property of the request. And we also have H2 in push that depends on requests being cacheable separately. So as you say, the algorithm is more complicated, but I don't know if the right solution to that is to just simplify away one of the considerations.
Yeah. I think to me, the heart of this issue, or at least this confusion in the editorial sense, is that we use the word cacheable in a couple of different ways. And if we can find a better term, that would be great. And then we need to find a way to backport that to 7540 so that the linkage is preserved, as you rightfully point out. I'm happy to try and do that editorially, and if people have a problem with how I do it, then we can talk over it then. I can't do it in my head now, though, so.
I'd say the other option would be to remove the requirement from 7540. It's like, at least I don't remember why it's there.
I think we'd have to consider that pretty separately, because that was a pretty extensive conversation. For example, H2 push doesn't have a way to put a body, I don't think, on the request that's being pushed on the promise. So that would be problematic for most uncacheable request methods, or many at least. Syntactically, there's nowhere to put it, if I remember correctly.
Yeah, that sounds interesting, but it's not a product of cacheability. That would be a different, that would be an entirely different requirement.
Maybe.
Yeah. Anyway, it's not our specs, so we don't have to worry about it.
All right. Well, let me go and see if I can and hook all that together in a sensible way that clarifies this, and then we'll see how much people like that. Next up, 51, mime sniffing. Actually, I think we're almost done this one now, aren't we? Do we need to actually talk about this one with the group, or I'm going to go ahead? So we have a PR on this one, I believe. Where's the PR? There we are. Is that the right one? No, it's not.
186.
186?
Or that was the one up above.
Oh, where?
There's two listed.
Oh,
No? The one below?
oh, thank you. I'm just blind. Oh, great. There we go. Yeah. That's not helping, is it? So basically, we're changing this text. We already talk about mime sniffing kind of indirectly, I think. And this just hones that a little bit to link it into the established work on mime sniffing that the WHAT working group is doing, and reference that, and give some advice about how to do that, and encourage implementers to provide a means to turn it off. And so we referenced the mime sniffing spec. We had a point where we also referenced the X content type options header field as a way to turn it off from the server. And in discussion, we removed that because it was basically pulling in a reference to the entire fetch specification, even though this is like basically 3 lines in the fetch spec. And we opened a bug on the mime sniffing spec to ask them why they didn't even mention X content type options. It seems like it's relevant there. Does anybody have any strong feelings about this? Or comments? He commented, I think, before we had our discussion. Let's take a look real quick. Anna says X content type options is definitely recommended to some extent. It's the only way to avoid a certain set of issues. I think Julian was tempted to add the phrase a certain set of issues to the spec, but he controlled himself. So if folks are happy with that, we'll just merge that PR. Does anybody feel like we need to mention X content type options explicitly? I see shaking heads, or at least a shaking head. Okay. Number 30 is field name syntax. Which one is this? Ah, yes. We talked about this before. So header field names are defined as tokens. It's an extremely permissive syntax, including some characters that are surprising to many people. And so I proposed that we find some way to cut that down so that people don't have weird characters in their header field names with the possible security vulnerabilities. And Martin just thumbs up that, and we had a lot of discussion on the issue, and everybody thought that this was a swell idea. And then we talked about it in Bangkok, and people were scared of changing things, so we backed away from doing that. And I was confused because I thought we had consensus to constrain the syntax of header fields, and we didn't. So I think that's, here we are. In Bangkok, no real consensus, concern about compatibility, reconsider on impact of a case-by-case basis, I guess. And then we have a little bit more data coming in. So what do people think about this? I still believe that it would be good for the web overall if we didn't have header field names with exclamation points or dollar signs or other fun characters in them. Call me crazy, especially considering the places that they get exposed in. And it seems like some implementations are already limiting this set and not experiencing horrible consequences in doing so. What would make people more comfortable in paring this list down? Maybe we could get some telemetry from browsers. Maybe we could get some telemetry from CDNs. What would people like to see here?
So anecdotal experience about things that are already forbidden in either field names or field values is that I saw some people break their services when they moved from HTTP1 where it's forbidden but tolerated to H2 where it's forbidden but actually breaks the connection. So I think getting some telemetry would be good, and I suspect that telemetry to be non-zero, even though H2 currently helps in bringing everyone into the fold when it comes to the current restrictions.
I'm not sure I understood you there, because H2 doesn't constrain the set of characters except in terms of case. The case normalizes, but it doesn't disallow these special characters.
I think the breakage that I saw was around non-ASCII characters.
In header field names or header field values?
Both.
Fine.
Mike Bishop, also in favor of getting some telemetry. I was mostly wanting to comment that when we were doing HPAC originally, Chrome did telemetry of how frequently different characters occur, which is how we generated the Huffman table. So that data, it may be difficult to find because we have different people now, but that data does exist somewhere, and worst case could probably be recreated.
Mike, could you move to your, just move that way. Just, yeah. Okay. If only we had a Chrome engineer here. Sorry, go on.
Unfortunately, there's no good because it concentrated on names and values. We're interested in names only.
Just names.
Because we have relatively short encodings for quotes and equal signs, which are not even under consideration here, I hope.
I think equal signs are allowed by, well, I'd have to check. No, it's token, never mind.
I think it would be, Julian here, I think it would be good if we actually had a few examples of problems caused by these characters in practice, like open bug reports or evidence of breakage. I'm not convinced that we actually have a problem that we need to solve by essentially changing the protocol.
Alan Frindell, just commenting on header problems that happen between H1 and H2, we actually experience the opposite problem because HPAC, you can have all kinds of characters get decoded out of your HPAC decoder, which are not valid necessarily for HTTP semantics. So sometimes we see weird stuff come with H2, new lines and things like that.
So it seems like we could gather data based upon existing web traffic. And it seems like it'd be good to get that both from the browser side and from a high volume server. But the browser side, I guess the server side, the population is a little more constrained.
You can also probably scan the HTTP archive for.
Yep, thank you. And also, I think we can probably examine some implementations to see what they allow and disallow, and that might be very interesting in informing this kind of decision. And I can also probably put some tests, at least for intermediaries, to look at what some of them do. So I guess this is we can flag this needs data, and maybe we can make some progress that way. Let me ask, if we find data that shows that a number of implementations already clamp this down to a subset of what's allowed by the spec, and we have data that the use of these characters is an outlier, is there a will in the group to try and change the spec? Does that help? Is it just the discomfort that we don't know I see some nodding heads.
I just go back to a little bit to the specific example. There was an attack on servers called Shell Shock, which was an attack on the bash executable. And one of the pathways to that was the CGI interface and how the CGI interface used environment variables to construct requests. And the problem that we encountered within Apache was unless you're careful about translating the received header fields, those header fields turn into HTTP underscore header field name in the environment. And that becomes an exploit for shell shock for some of these characters. And so internally, we've already removed some of these characters from that which we're willing to accept, which is why I'm fine with removing some characters. So that's what our experience has been, and why we'd want to remove these characters. And a specific example of why, whether we have to or not, I don't know.
Ron Gondwana, is there any case that anyone knows of where these characters are used in headers for real reasons? Is there any, I mean, obviously we're only a few of the hundreds of thousands of people who do things with HTTP, but if we don't have a single case where it is useful, then cutting it out makes sense to me.
I think that's an important comment. It's also an important comment to note that the tail is very, very, very long, and people operating with what has been clearly defined within that, we would need a compelling reason to break compatibility with that. And perhaps we have a compelling reason, but that should, in my view, really be the bar. And I will remind the authors, this is a BIS document essentially, right? And so if we are documenting the fact that many implementations currently restrict this set, right? And so for interoperation, you should work within those constraints. And we've got some comments from like HA Proxy and I think Nginx in this list that suggest that might be the case. Then I think this makes a lot of sense for core. If we're really discussing this as like, this is the way we think the protocol should be for security reasons, that might be a different document.
Yeah, okay. So let's gather some data. My sense is that this first proposal that I made to cut it down really substantially might be too ambitious, and that maybe we just need to look at, there are a few problematic characters that a lot of implementations have already blacklisted anyway, so let's just recognize that. Let's see where we go. Clarify rules around half-closed TCP connections. Issue number 22. This is, of course, against the H1 messaging spec. And Brad points out that HTTP says nothing about half-closed TCP. And there's a lot of back and forth on this issue, as you can see. In Bangkok, we said we need to collect data about behavior, but we didn't assign that to anyone. So I'm bringing this back up now to figure out how we can make some progress there. Of the people who care about this issue, I'm not sure if there's anybody in the room. We've had some participation from folks in the room, but it seems like the folks who really care about this are folks like Willie and Brad Fitz and Kazuho, were you? There he is. Was this one of the issues that you were really interested in, if you remember? No, not really. Oh well, I can live in hope. So does anybody want to volunteer to try and collect some data about this? Because otherwise I don't see a way to move it forward. David, you referenced a different issue from it. Oh, that's a quick working group. Okay.
Mike Bishop, I guess my question would be specifically what data are you looking for? Because the data you asked for in Bangkok was, does anyone do this?
Yeah.
And we found a few old and rare things that do. And really, I think the question is, how much are we willing to break the old and rare clients to have a more predictable behavior for everyone else? I don't think there's data to be had about that. I think that's a working group decision.
It's more of a judgment call. Yeah. I think another part of the problem is that if I'd characterize the folks coming forward and asking for this, it sure would be nice. It's kind of the approach they're taking, and it doesn't seem like a lot of other people care, and so there's not a lot of energy. And when you're talking about potentially breaking things, that's not enough to get across the bar.
Alan Frindell, I'm sorry because I was part of that discussion in Bangkok, but I've forgotten what is the behavior we are proposing with half-closed TCP.
We don't define it at all. Yeah. So it could have a couple of different semantics. I think the proposal, let's see. Mike, do you?
So
This is
basically,
a nice little, yeah.
basically the issue is when an application closes the send side of its TCP connection, technically from a TCP standpoint, all it's saying is, I have no intention of sending anything else, but I'm still here and receiving.
Right.
But there are a number of servers that take the perspective that once they receive the FIN, the client has initiated closure of the connection and they are no longer interested in the response. Now, when I worked on HTTP/SYS, we found a couple of clients where IIS had that behavior, it broke them, we had to help them revert it. Now, they are rare. It's like an old version of .NET and something in Java from IBM that we don't have more detail about. And I think the list has, well, through the issue, a few others may have been mentioned. I think
You're talking about clients that half close.
clients that half close, and we're trying to, the request is, can we give guidance to servers that it's okay to make this assumption or that you must not make this assumption? Because right now, it's undefined, servers have gone both ways, and if client and server pick different directions, the connection fails at the end of the request.
Yeah. So, I mean, I think the only thing I would, wow, that's mic'd up. The only thing I would add to that would be that the servers generally interpret, or when they do interpret the half close as essentially a full abandonment of the session, they are right for some approximation of several nines worth of being right. And there are some scaling properties associated with not doing that, right? So sometimes you have clients that just plain go away in black hole, they send a FIN and they disappear off the network. And that creates a bit of a problem for the server who is really insistent upon, viewing this as a half close and sending the response, buffered and retried and all that kind of thing. So they're just doing what is right more often than not. And so if I were to clarify the rule, I would, in my view, say that that's an important scaling property of HTTP, and we should be biased in favor of that instead of really old clients that are kind of hard to identify while still acknowledging, perhaps in the document, that you might create some very old legacy breakage.
Mike Bishop, I'll also note that in the definition of connect for H3, we have the text that clients should not attempt to use a half open TCP connection. It will break for some percentage of servers.
Martin Duke, I just point out that when you try to implement a 2-to-1 or 3-to-1 proxy, the logic is very different. I believe in 2 and certainly in 3, the stream needs to be finned before the response. It's supposed to be finned before the response comes. So if you're trying to mirror that to an H1 connection on the back end, it's not impossible to implement, but it's somewhat more complicated.
So what are we going to do? Yeah. What do we want to hum on?
Martin Duke, I just wanted to, Eric made a good point, which is that
for clients, there is a signal. If they no longer get anything, it's called TCP reset. And they should use that if they don't want the data. And it's perfectly reasonable to shut down the send side of a connection and wait to receive the rest.
Right. I can imagine it being very reasonable to say clients should not send a half close, but servers have to accept it. I think that's the most conservative approach. So I guess, do we want to figure out, do we want to do any text here? Like, do we first want to say, like, should we clarify this?
Yeah.
Do we agree that this is an area that has lack of clarity? So do you want to hum on that? Or?
Let's hum on that one first.
Okay, let's hum on that. Yeah? Yeah? What do you think?
How many people have an informed hum? Like, I would like to know that. Because we have
How many
number
people
of
care
list
about
participants.
this?
Yeah, we have a number of list participants.
Raise your hand if you care about this.
I see a lot of half hands.
Half hands. People have moderate
I
concerns.
see
Okay.
2 hands over here.
Appropriate for a half close, a half hand.
This is Roy again. I think somewhere in the issue, I volunteered to look into it when we get to that part of rewriting the messaging spec, because right now we haven't delved into how do we pull all the semantics out of the messaging, and we are set to do that very soon, in theory, at least. So I'm still on the hook for doing that. I still agree that it needs to be done, but I don't know what shape or form it will be at this point.
So maybe we should just note that there's a decent amount of interest in,
Okay.
in there's certainly not disinterest in
Yeah.
figuring this out.
Should we know one way or the other? Just if there's interest.
We can try. Everybody has it paged in. Let's try.
Go for it.
Go for
All right.
it. Yeah.
Okay, so let's try to see what people think. Let's do a hum, and the question will be, if you think that we should add text to clarify client sending a fin to make a half-closed TCP connection, please hum. This is to add text. Okay.
Just add some.
Just add some text to clarify behavior. Doesn't matter what behavior it is. Should we even be adding stuff first? No? Well, I'd like to. How much do we care? So please hum now. Okay. And do people think that we shouldn't clarify anything and just kind of leave it as is? Please hum now. Okay. So stronger for adding stuff, but there are some people who don't care. So do we, I mean, I don't think we have anything too much more.
We could ask which side they come on, whether the EOS means the client's no longer interested or just no.
Is the proposal to say that the clients should use it as a point of signaling? Like that we should define semantics around it?
Well, the tension.
No, I don't think we're right.
Okay.
No, I think we need to.
Because the tension that I understand is that on the one hand, some clients want to use it as a signal, and on the other hand, some servers are saying, well, often that signal is trash and I am wasting resources. And I think that's the tension here.
Well, specifically for this report, Brad wanted it as an indication that the client is no longer interested in the content, and that receiving a half close was treated as equivalent to receiving a reset. And the problem with that being is that it's never really had that interpretation in the past. There's always been hacks around trying to use it for other reasons. So the question was really, should we add a new distinction that says, if you receive a half close, you must not send a response? Because that would be the distinction. And I don't believe that is something we should add to HTTP.
I tend to agree with you
Yeah.
there.
Right.
Mike Bishop again. I think the first thing we need to put in there is clients should not do this. And then between whether the server should ignore that the fin arrived or must ignore that the fin arrived, must is probably less breakage, because otherwise you have two shoulds that can overlap and break, and that's where we are today.
It sounds like a proposal to me.
Yeah, that sounds like a proposal. Want to hum on the proposal?
People understand what Mike just said as a proposal? Mike, you want to restate?
Yeah. My proposal would be client should not fin the connection until they're done with it, and servers must not abort a response because the client sent a fin.
Questions about the proposal?
Counter.
Alan Frindell, was it ever legal for an HTTP 1.0 post body to be terminated by a fin? Because our code will work that way. With no content. If it did have no content length. Was that ever legal?
I think Patrick's looking something up. Jeffrey, you had a question?
This is Jeffrey Yaskin. I'm sympathetic to Brad's comment in what's on the screen that it is difficult for them in a portable way to distinguish fin from reset. I don't have any personal experience with this, and Brad isn't here to give his argument. So taking the proposal, which would say no, you're wrong, seems strong.
Just a clarifying question on Mike's. This is Martin Duke about Mike's proposal. So the intent of the should not is because some servers are likely to not comply with this. The response was yes. That's the intent.
Okay. So I'm away. Oh, you wanted to clarify?
Patrick, yes.
Well, yeah, I'm not clarifying. I guess I'm advocating, so I'll let Tommy consider the hums. But I think the server must not reset might be overstepping, giving some existing server behavior that I think actually is in the interest of HTTP and the internet. Although, I mean, I appreciate the technical consideration of the long tail of the 1995 CGI client, but I'm not sure like that's actually the decision I'm proud of, even though I would like to maintain compatibility where possible.
Mike Bishop, in terms of respecting existing implementations, a should not and a should makes perfect sense. But then the reality is that permits exactly the failure mode that the issue says we should try and figure out.
Well, I mean, the other option, and Roy doesn't like it, but I mean, the other option is servers should close the connection upon receiving a close from the client.
Yeah, maybe should or should not the right thing, but then you might need to add a bit more text explaining the problem. That actually might be the right thing, explaining why this text.
Yeah, Eric Kinnear. I think I'm slightly opposed to the server should close the connection, but at the same time, I'm sympathetic to the desire behind it. So if there's some other way to accomplish that, that'd be real nice. But at the same time, I'm not sure that there is.
Right. I mean, I can see that there's probably some room for the editors to massage the text on it. Even if we go in kind of with the intention of saying, you must not just use this fin to reset your connection. There's going to be some wiggle room, I imagine, of saying, but maybe you can put it on a list to idle out quickly because, you do something else. But don't use that alone as a signal. Right. Okay, so should we hum the room? Okay. So based on Mike's proposal, I think without really specifying if it's a should not or must not on the server. So the proposal is the client should not send a fin when it's still expecting a response. And the server should not, must not, is discouraged from just immediately closing the connection upon receiving a fin. Right. If you support this idea as a way to resolve this issue, please hum now. If you do not think this is a good way to resolve this issue, please hum now. Okay, so it seems like we had a decent hum in favor of using this approach going forward, not knocking the walls down with its loudness. And we had a couple outliers on the other side, but
Could I just ask, if you hummed in either direction, can you raise your hand? Okay, the acoustics of this room are horrible. I'm just trying to judge how much of the room that was.
in the other direction being.
They were both incredibly weak to my ear. But it's,
So just do hands.
Okay.
oh, I don't know if we can do that.
Are we allowed to?
Could you put up your hand if you support this proposal? Mike Bishop, the Bishop proposal, yes. It will be remembered in history as the Bishop proposal.
Okay.
And if you do not support the proposal? Okay. We have 3-ish do nots, I think. Could
Sound
anybody interested in explaining why they think this is a bad thing? You have.
Yeah.
Okay. Maybe a little more discussion, but
Sure.
well, at least we have
That can be a
start of a
direction
direction. Yeah.
For a PR.
Yeah. Maybe we can address those concerns in the PR. Okay, great. That is further than I thought we would get there. It's cold. So cold. Okay, number 7. This is Julian's. Oh, yes. So Julian made the comment that we should probably discuss when it's appropriate to do something like defining the syntax of a header as an alternation of two different things, like either a star or a list of things, and whether that's a good thing or not, and error handling around that, because it's an awkward construct in a lot of cases. And I made the comment that I'd prefer to document this as an anti-pattern, and Reschke agreed, but when he objected for alt service, he was in the rough. And Roy said, So I guess you know how the three of us feel. How do other people feel?
So how many header field definitions have this problem?
If range, there are a bunch that do star or other stuff.
And as a practical matter, if anyone goes star and then puts something else in,
Yeah,
work,
great
right?
question.
I mean, invalid or not, it's still going to get a comma spliced in there, and it's going to go off and do whatever it does. So it really is a list syntax anyway. So
I mean, I think. Go ahead.
Well, effectively everything is a list. Effectively everything is a list syntax. Mechanically, from the semantic standpoint, I mean, the reason to have a star there is a shortcut, not a validation scheme or whatever. So, I mean, if you have a star, comma, whatever, it has the same effect as just star in all those cases. So it's never really been a concern in the past. I mean, I agree that from a cleanliness perspective, it's kind of been pooped on, but it's not the only thing that we have that's weird in HTTP.
Right.
So I don't think, at this point, I don't see any way to fix it. Really.
Felix Hanta, except encoding is an example where you can have star, comma, other things.
There's a bunch of them, yeah.
Julian, just to clarify, this is not about changing the spec in some way. It's, I guess, guidance for people defining new header fields.
Yes.
And I think, well, the choice is to either have it explicitly as an alt service or to just make it a list and put the constraints into the pros. And we have the related issues that talk about list type header fields. And the question is this a list type header field now? If the grammar is this or that. So I think it causes more confusion than the potential more concise ABNF solves.
So you're explicitly including headers like ifrange where it's entity tag or HTTP date, not just star. Yeah.
But I did actually change the spec since this was put in here, so that's no longer a concern, at least from a other restrictions standpoint, in the sense that, there's a part of the spec where it talks about if you have list format, it's a comma separated list format, and if it's not defined as list format, then you can't use the comma. You can't have multiple forms of that. And what it now says is if you have at least one of the alternatives for the field definition being a list format, then you can have a comma separate. So there used to be a logic failure in the spec. Now it's just an ugly failure. And like I said, we can change the spec all we want, but that's not going to change the fact that there exist these definitions for these header fields, and we're unlikely to change them just for this reason.
I don't think anyone's suggesting that we change if range, for example. It's the question of, do we recommend this as a good practice for new headers? And you agree that we shouldn't? Okay.
So I just wanted to point out that if we have the syntax as in the alt servers example, we've got potential interop problems when, for instance, you have star comma and one recipient might say that doesn't conform to the ABNF and ignores it, and the other sees a list typed header of length 1 and says that's okay. So actually it's clear in this case, not star, but you see my point. So if you have clear comma, is that an invalid header field instance?
Yeah. A much cleaner way to do this would have been to define clear as a special alt value, and then to register it effectively, and then just if it appears in the list, then it has that meaning, rather than doing this weird thing. Yeah. I don't remember you bringing that up. Oh, so I shouldn't have said stupid Mark.
It used to be that way in an earlier draft, and in the end it was changed.
Okay.
So that was the consensus for some reason.
That's probably McManus. Let's go with that. All right. So it sounds like we just need to try and figure out what to write down in the recommendations for new header fields. I will point out that with structured headers, this is impossible. So that's a nice attribute of that. Okay.
So before we leave the topic of core, I would like to thank the team. As Julian pointed out in his presentation, there's been a ton of activity around this since we last met. This is mostly thankless work, but I will offer my thank you, so you get one in there. And others should do the same. And if you would like to make 1,400 GitHub entries yourselves, I'm sure you can, make the acknowledgements. But I wonder if the editor team would like to talk about schedule and how they think this project has been going. It's a pretty big scope, and what we have in our future.
Yeah, we actually talked about that earlier, and I think we're still very confident we're going to beat Quick.
That's the measure of success.
Yeah.
Oh, this is waiting for you.
Yeah, we'll have a better idea sort of this time next week, but certainly we intend to do a lot more work on it during this week. So hopefully the pace will pick up considerably. I know I for one have been terribly consumed by other things than this.
Just to be clear, when he says we and this week, he means Julian and Roy, not me this week.
Yeah, right. I mean, yeah. I plan on making all the changes that Mark objects to, and this week and then next week.
Why is there so much churn in the caching spec?
Do you have a target date in mind? Is it this year?
I think it's this year. I think it's this year. For me, at least personally. For me, a lot of these issues, I want to, I'm in this mode where I'm writing tests for the caching stuff, and I want to make most of the stuff in the caching spec covered by tests. We haven't started doing that for the other specs, but we potentially could do that too, if people wanted to put resources into it. But yeah, I want to make it driven by implementation behavior where I can. So that's taking a bit of my time right now. But yeah, I'd say working group last call, Singapore-ish would be aspirational. I didn't say which Singapore meeting. Okay, thank you. Yeah, I think so.
See you on Thursday.
Thanks for getting through that.
Blue sheet. Where's the blue sheet?
Blue sheet.
Oh yeah, blue sheet.
I got one.
One more blue sheet?
Sounds really hot.
Yeah.
Look around. Check this down. In that you can't send the pen until you see the